Good afternoon. This is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association, an organization founded in 1970 with a focus on closing gaps in our Texas public schools. We have the delight this afternoon of having with us a longtime friend of MASBA, a part of ERO, an architectural firm in McAllen, Texas, which, if you've seen our MASBA logo before, as we see on this first slide of our presentation, we are excited to say that this logo was designed by our friends at ERO Architects. Our presenter this afternoon is Principal and Chief Marketing Officer Brian Godinez, who has a long history with MASBA, who led various strategic planning retreats for MASBA in the past, and who came to MASBA. The story I like to tell is that at one point in our history, ERO came to MASBA and said, we don't want to sponsor at all the other levels that other sponsors are sponsoring at. We want to create our own higher sponsorship level. And so that year we created the adamantium sponsorship level for our friends at ERO Architects. So welcome, Brian Godinez of ERO Architects. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm looking forward to talking about one of my favorite topics as it relates to facilities and planning, especially how to assist school districts in passing bonds.
Awesome. And Brian, we appreciate your help because for those of us who are on the line, superintendents and trustees, we know that bonds are important for us to be able to meet the needs that we have with respect to facilities. I joined our board here in the Austin ISD in November of 2012, and it was within 2 months of that we called our $500 million bond election in May of 2013. That was my first experiences of bond planning and bond elections myself. After that, as you well know, Brian, here in the Austin ISD, we had a $1 billion bond in 2017. So that's $1.5 billion of bonds that we've had here in the Austin ISD in the 7 years that I've been on the board, knowing that that's helping us to meet the needs of our students. So really appreciate, Brian, your willingness to lead us through long-range facility bond planning today. Take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. And unfortunately, as successful as you were in Austin and many other school districts, many school districts still struggle in terms of the right kind of planning and what they need to do to pay for and or invest in on their educational and learning environments, the platform that they create for the next 10, 20 years for their students. It can be challenging, it can be overwhelming. So I'm hoping today we can provide some good information, insights, and some tips and knowledge in terms of how to successfully plan for a bond program in the future. A little bit about me, who I am. Let me see about changing my slide here. I want to be able to do that. There we go. I've spent over 35 years in communications, public engagement, public relations, political campaigns over the last 20 years, and done quite a bit of opinion and attitude surveying. I focus primarily in public sector and have for the last 25 years. And I've worked for private and public entities throughout major markets in the United States, with specifically in the area of media. And my training is in communications. I'm a marketing specialist and been with ERO now for 16 years and serve as the chief marketing officer. I'm a principal and owner of the firm. Our firm has been now organized and doing business with over 300 design projects throughout the state of Texas for the last 20 years. And one of the areas I focus in is in community engagement. And we offer school districts and owners our bond planning services and marketing and communication services. And so I get to interact and talk quite a bit and spend a lot of time with school districts throughout the state. And I learn a lot of the ebbs and flows and the do's and don'ts of facility planning as well as bond planning. So that's who I am. That's my background. I love this quote, and I want to start out with this quote. It's especially important when we have a lot of elected officials out there throughout the state of Texas, is that leadership is not about the next election, it's about the next generation. And many times political or politicians focus on what they want to accomplish during their term as opposed to long term. and thinking about the next generation. This is a great quote by Simon Sinek, and I don't know if you've seen him on TED Talks, but we need to think about that our children, our elementary school children who are in the ages of 5 and 6, have the possibility of being our future workforce well into the next century for the next 80 and 90 years, given their longevity and how long they are planning to live for a long time. And so we need to be thinking about how long we need to plan for, and those multiple generations of students that we're dealing with today, and who they're going to be 20, 30, or even 90 years from now. And that's important.
I love how he goes that long-term perspective, Brian. You know, buildings last a long time, so talk about legacy. The buildings that you all helped to design for districts like ours, it's thinking long-term.
Yeah, most of the life cycle of the buildings that we're planning for now in K through 12 in education, we're looking at 70 up to 80 years of life cycles, specifically the larger buildings when you get into high schools and performance centers and big athletic complexes. You're looking at life cycles beyond 50 years. So you need to be thinking about what education is going to look like 20, 30, or 40 years from now. Well, I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute when we get into the planning phase of my presentation. So we're going to cover 4 specific topics today. The first one is a framework for need. And what does the need look like? And I've got good examples of what that means in just a sec when we get there. The second section of my presentation today will be about the framework for planning, long-range plans, and how we use those as a roadmap for the future of education and how education connects to facilities. Very key, learning environments connecting to the pedagogy or curriculum of a school's vision and goals in terms of their education of their students. The third one is a framework for the bond. And bonds only work if they pass. They're useless if they don't pass. And we'll talk about how to put together a bond, not only from the perspective of a school district, but how it works into the community with a community leading an effort. And then lastly, I want to spend a little time on a case study, a framework for success, and how we got a particular bond program that went and failed twice and how we get it to pass within 3 months. So we'll go over that at the end. All right, so let's focus on a framework for need. And some of these images that I'm about to show you are probably representative of many school districts that we deal with all the time. How many school districts have aging facilities that have gone well past their life cycle with rusted amenities and fixtures, problems with roofs and ceilings, windows that just aren't closing anymore, or not enough windows and not enough daylight coming in, or the artificial lighting in the buildings is just not up to speed or par anymore, or we're in portables now, and the portables themselves are aging. And so there are many, many types of facilities that their condition is just not up to par anymore. And it's time to take a look at the overall district in terms of the condition of facilities. In a minute, I'll talk about what a facility condition index means and how you actually assess a building to determine whether it needs to be replaced or it needs to be renovated, or just minor repairs just to bring up its learning environment to be able to adequately educate the students. But we know that we deal with this. And any building that needs to be replaced or renovated can be extremely costly. And in many cases, it's something you just can't get out of a maintenance and operation fund or a facilities fund when you're dealing with maintenance of 20, 30, or 40 facilities in a district, and in some cases over 200 or 300 when you get to the bigger districts. But the bigger issue that we deal with is overcrowding. And unfortunately, we are squeezing way too many kids into classrooms. The ratio that we strive for is 26 to 28 to 1 per teacher, but in many cases we exceed that. And this is taking a toll on teachers and students. I mean, we're literally burying our kids inside these classrooms. And it's just we're fortunate to have a state that has a high maintaining growth rate of over 3 to 4%. And in many cases, you have school districts whose hospitals are producing an elementary school per month. That's 700 to 800 kids per month because of the rapid growth that our state experiences. Now, some school districts flat and don't have as much growth as other school districts, but overcrowding is probably the principal reason why you want to get into facility planning and why you want to consider either adding more education facilities or changing the classroom environments that have been going on since the 1800s with the teacher in the front and the rows and rows and rows of students. So I want to give you the perspective and get you into the frame that there is a need, and in many cases, many districts, even passing bonds, the need still exists. So you've got student enrollment increasing, you've got buildings age increasing or the need for more education facilities, and what do you do in terms of financing or investing in these challenges and issues we deal with? Well, the question is, do you call a bond election? How do you get to that decision? What kind of metrics, what kind of information, what kind of data do you need to be able to call a bond election? Some of you have successfully called bond elections. Some of you know, as Jamie was speaking about, have passed, in the case of Austin, $1.5 million, $1.5 billion in bond. That decision took years to get to, with a lot of planning, a lot of facilities assessments, a lot of community input, a lot of professionals involved in the process over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 years sometimes. And in some smaller districts, it may only take 6 months to a year to get to that decision to determine if your community is ready to pass a bond, if they're ready to take a tax impact that may be higher than what they're paying now, if they're ready to go out and make that commitment in the community. So it's a question that every one of our school board officials and or our administrators face on a daily basis. So let's talk about a framework for planning. This is probably the more technical of the presentation today, and I'll go through it a little slow and I'll pause from time to time, and I may repeat myself a little bit because it can get a bit technical, it can get a bit overwhelming in terms of planning for long range facilities, master plan, and bond planning. So let me move my control panel over here to the right so that I can see. So a long range facilities master plan is developed with 2 strategies in mind, 2 core strategies. One is to address the need for facility improvements. And in many cases, a facilities master plan, long range, is usually 10 years. That's the typical timeline going out. And why 10 years? Because within 10 years, you have the ability to maybe roll out 1, 2, or 3 bonds every 3 or 4 years, as in the case of Austin ISD, what they did over the course of 5 years. And it gives you the ability to create strategies to make capital investments that support our educational programs, both currently and in the future, with one primary goal in mind. And what we've learned now is that students who are engaged are the ones whose achievement levels continue to keep increasing and rising. So engage students inside of good learning environments with teachers that are engaged as well is what you're looking for when you're developing your planning. That little graphic on the right is a master plan that was done, that we did for Weslaco Independent School District down in South Texas. They had never done a long range facilities master plan in all of the years that they've been in existence. It was their first commitment to a 10-year master plan. It's complete now, and they now have established an educational goal, an educational vision, along with determining what's best for their 21 education facilities and all of the administration support facilities that are in the district. I'll give you an example of one who had never done a long-range facilities master plan. As huge as they are, Dallas ISD. They just completed a long-range facilities master plan, a 10-year plan, and had never done one before. Now that's a district with over 250 facilities. And we all know how huge those districts are in terms of operational budgets, maintenance, facility operations, administrators, educators, staff. So anywhere from a small school district with 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 facilities, education facilities, up to over 250 or 300, long-term planning is critical to determine the direction, the roadmap you need in terms of building environments for students and teachers that are fully engaged through the process. Hold on a second here, Jamie. I'm trying to get my slides to work here in combination with the webinar. So
No problem.
there are two key phases that are involved in long-range facilities master plan, and there are 6 fundamentals that are entwined and overlap during the sequence, whether you're in a 6-month process or a 12-month process. These are your core elements. And phase 1 starts with assessment and discovery. First off, you have to determine where the growth trends and enrollment projections are headed for your district. You got to get an idea, a good snapshot of your demographics to determine what your growth rate is, to see if your classrooms are adequately functioning and have the adequacy for education in terms of their use and their functions. And then you want to start getting into those facilities and understanding exactly what they are from an assessment standpoint. Do they need to be replaced? How are their HVAC systems operating? How are their walls and ceilings and lighting and security functions? The number of classrooms combined with the number of students in terms of functionality and adequacy as it relates to education, the gyms, all of the athletics, everything that's involved in the education system and all of the environments that are involved. You literally have a team that walks in with clipboards and electronic devices and cameras and video systems, and they sit down and they walk through with principals and custodians to determine exactly the assessment of the facilities. While that's going on, we usually bring in an educational planning consultant, somebody who specializes in vision, who can sit down and work with administrators, work with a superintendent's cabinet, work with the board, work with certain stakeholders to determine exactly where the district wants to go and how they want to get there with regards to their vision and goals, what those guiding principles are going to be. Like, for instance, the learning environment supporting instruction. And is community engagement part of that process? And does the educational vision and mission reflect the district's own level of instruction where they want to be from a goal standpoint, from an objective standpoint? All of that is congruently going on while your facilities are being assessed and determining their condition, whether they're new or very, very old. They all have some level of assessment and or requirement of some level of attention. Might be minor and it could be major, like as in replace, demolish, and replace with a new facility. That's phase 1. All through this process, community involvement is going on. You've got stakeholders that are participating. You've got parents and teachers. You've got everyone participating in the process with a well-executed plan by good professionals that understand educational planning and facility planning. Then the next phase is where you start developing solutions and recommendations. You start devising and analyzing solution options for how to either replace and or to enhance, improve, or build new with regards to facilities, and do those learning environments, do those educational specifications, those requirements, those design requirements, construction requirements, do they match the education vision as you develop your master plan? Ultimately, you look at recommendations, what the community is going to want, what the students and teachers are going to want, what the educators, what the district will want, and you start developing that master plan until you finalize it and reach a consensus in the community in terms of that final master plan. So here are some of the phases and fundamentals a little bit more drawn out and articulated. The vision is very, very important. The district's educational program derives the development of the facilities and the master plan and how the community is involved in its execution. And that vision is critical. And when we were recently in Weslaco, we spent 3 months assessing facilities. And in those 3 months, we were also working with the community and all the stakeholders in terms of establishing a vision for how the district wanted to educate with teachers and students to have them engaged. The next fundamental aspect of that discovery, as I mentioned, is the entire process. Analyzing the existing data, knowing the facilities, knowing how the community relates to facilities, establishing priorities and strategies, and then proposing guidelines to how we govern and manage those facilities. Now, somewhere in the beginning or very soon when you begin your master plan, you do want to create some kind of task force. And it might be a combination of board members combined with cabinet members or principals or other stakeholders such as parents and teachers and community leaders. This ultimately is the team, and you want them engaged from the beginning all the way through the end so that there is buy-in. And remember that we're talking about long-range planning and bond planning. So ultimately, you are going to take this information and use it for a bond program. So what better way to start building consensus in the community than to have them involved in the planning so that there are skin in the game, they are buying in, they are part of the process, and ultimately those 30, 40, or 50 task force members of the community or committee become vessels of communication into the community, talking about what the district is doing to improve the district's learning environments and education. It's critical to have that team. I've seen some districts who've taken a planning team and converted it into a bond committee. And then I've seen some members of that planning committee turn into a political action committee to help the bond pass, to persuade the yes vote to get the vote out. So moving into the nuts and bolts part, this is where you start the inventory of all the facility data and you gather it, and it's part of the process because that data is critical to make decisions concerning which options and which facility needs, both physical and educational, you want to use. And I'll show you in just a minute what that could look like with one example of one school in terms of what that data is and how you use it long-term over 2, 3, or 5, or 7 years out with any particular school, whether it's a high school, middle school, whether it's a performing arts center, athletics, or it's an elementary school or an early college, high school. Whatever that function of that building is, every one of them has critical data in terms of its current condition and what needs to be done to either improve it or to replace it. The phase 2 components is getting the plan to work. So you determine a building's needs and then you prioritize those needs. Is it simple as just fixing the security and safety, the vestibules in the front, or adding some paint, or adding some windows, or expanding the parameter for there's more security, or is it actually adding more classrooms? Everything is determined based on priority and what the cost will be. And there's open dialogue and everyone is buying into that process of prioritization to ensure that everything is appropriate for the district in terms of needs as you finalize the plan. Once the plan is complete, the last fundamental component of it is to actually work the plan. You now have a roadmap. You have something in front of you to determine which bond, if a bond needs to be called. Is it a small bond, later a larger bond, and then years from now an even larger bond? You start thinking about a series of bond programs, maybe over the course of 10 years, to determine how you want to roll bonds out, at what level, for what specific needs, based on what priorities over the course of 10 years. So what I've gone over are 6 fundamental steps, from discovery, information, community input, to vision, to developing the plan, refining the plan, ultimately creating a final master plan. But one critical component that I've mentioned already more than once is to be sure to have an active community engagement process. Teachers, students, and parents who are actively touching those schools. Remember that the majority of the lives of students and parents are centered around one particular school. That is their universe. That is the center of a neighborhood, the center of a community, whether it's an elementary school, vertically, eventually up to a high school. That is their universe for the next 18 years or so. Community members, district administrators, and in some cases, even local political officials, all need to be involved in the process. Because again, where you're headed towards is eventually calling a bond, and you need 51% of the vote to pass the bond. So it's critical that they're involved early. When you decide to call a bond, they're already one step ahead in being fully informed about what it is that they're going to be calling the bond, which facilities we're talking about, what improvements need to be made, and that there's a consensus overall with the message for either yes or for to pass a bond. Jamie, if you
I'm
can
with
hear,
you.
this might be a good time just to see if you have any questions that you might want to ask me as I move into this last component of facility planning, or if you want to add anything based on your experience.
Be happy to. And at the same time, we want to remind all those who are joining us for this webinar that you can share any of your questions under the questions tab or as well under the chat tab. We'll be happy to ask them of Brian. Brian, really appreciate your drawing our attention to the importance of community input. So I hadn't thought about it before. Of course, we want to get the input of the community, which is why those committees are so important. But I guess that I had never thought before about how important it is use the word ambassador, to have these people who are knowledgeable about the process and about the ideas that have been shared and how the bond is shaping up, who can go back to their families and workplaces and communities to advocate for the bond. So I really appreciate you bringing that to our attention.
Yes, yeah, no, it's a very critical. As a matter of fact, we talk about a framework for passing a bond, one of the elements of that is how you utilize individuals to become vessels of communication into the community. I like the word ambassador. I like the way you use that. That is true, and and probably the most important ambassador, both in planning as well as in passing a bond, is the teacher. The teacher is the one that has the most interaction with students and families and parents, and they are your most vital ambassador, and important that they embrace and support a bond election. They're about as important as the local pastor or priest.
Yeah. So any insights into the composition of those committees? That is to say, as board members and as superintendents, we're often thinking about the line that exists between governance and management. As board members, we want to stay on our side of the line and focus more on governance. The administration wants us to stay on our side of the line as well, so it frees them and their staff to do the work of management. In your experience, is there a magic way of creating those committees so that it provides the input to the district that's necessary, but also so that it satisfies board member desires to have certain voices on that committee as well? How's that for a question?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute when we get to a framework for passing a bond. But I'll share with you now is that you have to remember that when you're starting to prepare for a bond call, by law, the district can only educate and inform. They can't persuade. They can't give a position on passing yay or nay or yes or no or for or against.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to think about the composition of your committees in terms of what their role will be in that fine line between informing and persuading. And so early on, it's all about building a case for need and being able to build a case to educate and inform the community about that need. And so anything related to need and the cost for improving or enhancing to satisfy the need, the committee stays within that conversation. Later, after a plan is done, a bond is called, the whole conversation shifts toward persuasion and shifts towards a get out the vote and get people out to vote yes for a bond. That's a different group and different committee. It doesn't mean that, for instance, during the planning, you can have all of these different stakeholders that we mentioned earlier. We talked about parents, teachers, and students, educators, and then we talked about community members, elected officials, civic organizations, civic organization leaders, even those in the faith. All of those are all part of learning and becoming aware of a bond and or plan and or the educational needs and facility needs of a district. But when that bond is called, that group can then separate. Some can be more involved in the education and informing, others can be involved in the persuasion. I'll show you in a minute what that looks like more graphically in just a second.
Tremendous, and appreciate as well. I just want to say there are many of us on the line as well who are thinking that when we think of bonds, it's not just the new buildings, but also none of our buildings are getting any younger. How it is that we need to be thinking about deferred maintenance as well, and how it is that bonds can help us to tackle the deferred maintenance needs of our districts. Here in the Austin ISD, for instance, I know that we have it's been estimated that we have about $5 billion with a B dollars in deferred maintenance. That is to say, if we were to bring all of our current facilities, all 130 schools, up to the best possible standards for our students and their learning. That would cost us as a district some $5 billion. Anything you might say about deferred maintenance as part of this long-term bond planning?
Yes, we spend quite a bit of time looking at the HVAC systems and the systems of buildings, and we determine and roofs and building envelope and everything that's related to deferred maintenance that specifically in the buildings, and we prioritize them. And that's what I was going to show you in just a minute here. I'm going to show you how we take a building and prioritize it, and then build it out over certain levels of prioritization, scattered over certain levels of years. And so, to answer your question more simply in a different way, a lot of school districts, they fear the rollout of a bond, or they're not sure if a bond will pass, or in the case of elected officials, will it affect their incumbency or reelection to call a bond? And some people think that when you call a bond, it has to be for the replacement of schools or the building of new schools. In many cases, they can be rolled out incrementally over 2 or 3 years and just focus on smaller items that are related to deferred maintenance, for instance, repair for new air conditioning systems or new roofs or building envelope issues or improving the parameter from a security standpoint or adding more security, within vestibules of some of the schools, et cetera. And so it can be a function of prioritization. And so in small school districts, $30–40 million might just be devoted strictly to deferred maintenance and or just improving and bringing and modernizing facilities up. And it may be as simple as painting. It may be as simple as expanding windows or et cetera. So my point is that it doesn't have to be a full rollout and addressing $5 billion all at one time. It could slowly roll out, focusing on certain aspects of deferred maintenance. And you got to remember, deferred maintenance can be funded in other methods besides bonds. There's maintenance tax notes. You can use other levels of funding sources to defer for deferred maintenance. There's also a lot of credits out there that are available. There's performance contracting for lighting, performance contracting for energy. There's a lot of ways to finance a lot of deferred maintenance issues that school districts go through. And you can and you do that as part of the planning process. This little graphic I have here in front of you that shows you a timeline. This is typically what it takes smaller school districts, small to medium-sized school districts. You can get a master plan done in 6 months, no longer than 8 months at the most. And what I've shown you here over the course of 6 months in 3 different color levels are where I've talked about in blue is the visioning, and then you get into all of the inventory data gathering. Ultimately, when you get to the gold elements of cost analysis, prioritization, workbook analysis, and then prepping the final report, that's where you start determining what's important to the district and how do we prioritize that. And with community input, you'll learn that safety and security might be first. Natural and artificial lighting might be second from a prioritization standpoint. Furniture may be more important than other aspects of a building. You determine based on inputting from stakeholders as well as educators and administrators, what are the priorities and how do, if we roll out over the course of 10 years, what do we focus on first to last? That prioritization is critical. And typically what we do is we break it into 3 different levels of priorities, 0 to 3 years, 4 to 7 years, and the third priority level, 7+ years out. And then we look at the prioritization of that based on each school's needs, from as simple as, I'm making this up, but security and safety, to as complex as adding more classroom space or replacing. And that's what I wanted to focus on, was that workbook analysis, and show you an example of what happens when you take one school and you've established the priorities over the course of its life cycle. So here's an elementary school. This is an elementary school that we just did. We did the full assessment of the school. It doesn't need to be replaced, because replacing an elementary school for 700 students could be anywhere from $25 to $30 million in cost for investment for a brand new elementary school. In this case, there was 6 different areas that we focused on, where we looked at the architecture in terms of what needed to be done with regards to restrooms or replaced furniture, athletics with a multi-purpose gym, building envelope, waterproofing, the drainage, the trees and the landscape, life safety and security, what needed to be done to doors and fire sprinklers and fire panels, and the vestibules at the front of the building for the entrance. And then finally, the mechanical, the deferred, the HVAC systems, what needed to be done. So you take that and you start adding all of the costs up and determine what that's going to cost for the next, over the next 3 years to 10 years to replace. And you're actually adding inflation to those costs, and you're determining a priority level of 1, 2, and 3, as well as does it meet educational adequacy in terms of its function as a building. And ultimately, you come up with a total over the course of 10 years. Priority 1 in the first year to 2 years, priority 2 and priority 3, and you determine from that life cycle priorities exactly what your spending will be. Now, imagine that elementary school times 20 facilities. Well, that immediate 1 million turns into 10 million, turns into 40 million, turns into 60 million. And you can see how each of these priority levels can multiply times the number of schools that you're dealing with. This particular school had a low facility condition index where it didn't have to be replaced. It was under the 60% threshold, but it needed work to improve it, to be able to improve the educational environments and to be able to match the educational vision and goals of the school. So you get a worksheet like this times the number of schools, and this gives the administrators, the board, gives the district tools to be able to determine when you roll out a bond, what do you call for that first bond, second bond, and third bond based on priorities. And that's the point I wanted to make here with this particular worksheet. I hope that makes sense, Jamie.
I love where you're going with that, Brian. I mean, especially as trustees and as superintendents, we're interested in thinking about how it is that we can save money on facility costs and direct more money toward the instruction of students. So sometimes there are some who think, well, let's save money on these particular facilities needs, but by doing that, there becomes this cost in the future as well. So, there's so many factors that we need to be considering that I'm so glad that there are professionals like yourselves who are able to guide districts like ours through planning processes regarding facilities.
And remember that while this is going on, and this may be architecturally engineering, technically focused and developed, congruently, as I mentioned earlier, you also have an educational planner who's working with the district from a goal setting standpoint and creating educational specifications so that ultimately, if this elementary school had to be replaced, you'd have the design guidelines, you'd have the building guidelines, and everything set to educational specifications to the educational programs to know that an elementary school, if you're going to spend $30 million to replace it, these are the guidelines you'd follow to be able to do instruction 10 years from now or 20 years from now, to be able to have engaged students that are ready for the workforce. And that's ultimately what you're building, is a roadmap to maintain existing campuses and plan for new learning environments to best support the vision of the district so that education is being met not only today, but 50, 60, 80 years from now. So with that, I'm going to go to the next section. We're going to talk about framework for bond. This is the third section. And this is the critical steps for you as a district, as leaders, what you need to do, the steps to prepare for passing a bond and doing it successfully. So there's 7 critical steps. The first step is to understand the community. And I mentioned already that planning and the development of master plan is the first big step. Now you have the tools, you've got community engagement, you've got community leadership, you've got stakeholders involved in that process. So understanding the community, a master plan gives you a very good idea of what the community's needs are from an education standpoint. And ultimately, as we know, the economic engine of a community is your educational system, is your K through 12 system. It is important that for the prosperity of a community to thrive and sustain for the next 50 years, the educational system, K through 12, needs to be strong, needs to be well-founded, it needs to be ready to produce students ready for the workforce. And so that synergy has to be not only with the district, but with the community as well. So you have to have an idea of what the community needs are based on the educational goal of a district. And so all that is done. The next thing is that the community leads the bond. So remember we talked about, and you brought this up, Jamie, that a facilities advisory committee has strong leaders. So when you're appointing that facilities advisory committee, you've got people out in the community that are pro-district, pro-education, pro-K through 12, have kids in the system, and are good leaders in our community. They can influence the engagement of community. They can help build consensus. A community with a strong advisory group can make recommendations with the district to call a bond. And that group can later merge into a political action committee to help fund a campaign to get the bond passed. Now, teachers, I mentioned this earlier, teachers are a critical step, and we need to work closely with teachers to be fully on board with a bond. They are the most trusted source of releasing district information. Every student and parent, the rank and file, the first line of involvement in the school district is the teacher. They communicate and they're closely connected to the community. They are the vessels. You need teachers not only talking positively about a bond, but also voting for the bond. They need to be embracing the bond because they have the most at stake than any other stakeholder in terms of what's being built, improved, or replaced for their learning environments. And teachers have all kinds of different ways of how they like to teach. And so they have to be involved in that educational learning process, that planning process, and ultimately when the bond is called. The biggest bond killer in a community is trust. You'll find 9 times out of 10, 95%, if a bond fails, you'll hear that they just didn't trust the board, they didn't trust the educators, they didn't trust the superintendent. Trust was not there. So you have to build a positive relationship with influencers and leaders in the community. All the networks in the community have to understand the need, and they have to help connect the district closer from need to the community. The superintendent, board members, and other officials have to play an active role from the beginning all the way to the end. They have to be those same vessels as we focused on teachers talking about the bond. Superintendent, board members, and other officials with the district need to be just as active. They have to participate, but they have to remember, as many of you know, you can't be persuading anyone on the site of a school property, but you can do it outside a school property. Some school board members, I've seen this before, they take the low road and they say, hey, I can't talk about the bond, so I can't get involved. That's not true. You can talk about the bond, you can inform people about the bond, and you can take a stand on the bond as long as you're not standing or sitting anywhere on school property. So they have to be actively involved. And you have to remind voters that the district and board will be accountable for spending wisely. So when a bond is called, those 7 board members have to literally sign a Magna Carta, a manifesto, that they are going to do and deliver exactly what the bond says. And Jamie, you know this very well, that when you call those bonds, you took an oath, you said to yourself with high levels of integrity that you're going to see to it that that bond was going to pass and that you were going to build exactly what you said you would when that bond is called. And that emotional connection is very, very important for the future of the district. And everyone needs to know that they can be trusted with taxpayer money to do what they say they're going to do. And one of the most successful messages when passing a bond is reminding people of the last bond that was passed successfully and show all the products that were delivered from the last bond. That way trust is built, and it's so, so important. Jamie, you want to add anything to that before I go on?
Well, I appreciate that. So our superintendent here in the Austin ISD, Dr. Paul Cruz, is famous for saying our organization moves at the speed of trust, right? Without trust, we are nothing. And when it comes to bond elections especially, we are asking voters for large, large sums of money. So I'm absolutely with you there. We absolutely have to build that trust and those relationships within our community, but also appreciate your words of how it is that all of us need to be actively advocating for these bond elections, all of us as trustees, I should say. That is to say, district staff and administration have to be more careful about their role in elections, because their role, of course, is not that of advocacy, but is of simply providing information. But we as trustees have an important role in helping our districts to get these bond elections passed. We have to make sure that we don't use any district resources. I remember when I joined our board in 2012 and we were ramping up for our May 2013 bond election, our legal counsel at that time said, don't even use a district pen or district notepad. When you're talking about the bond election, we have to make sure that there are absolutely no district resources used for this. So, you know, these are big and consequential things that we do as superintendents and trustees when we start talking about bond elections.
That is true. The 5th one is to listen to the community and use their feedback. And remember that messages in bond need to be simple, honest, genuine, and understandable. They can't be complicated. They can't be complex. You can't get into the weeds with voters and with supporters. Keep it simple, keep it emotional, keep the need out there. The theme should all be based on need. And then the why comes from those that talk positively about the bond. Leaders, teachers, those of influence, they'll have personal stories to say why this bond is important beyond the weeds of that we have to replace an HVAC system, or we have to do this, or we have to do that. It just comes down to trust and need. 6, we want to create a variety of communication tools. Social media is the strongest, best tool that's available out there. Bond information should be easy and accessible, both online and offline, with printed materials as well as digital. Keep everything clear and simple and transparent. And remember that you're constantly building trust and creating a positive connection with the voters. And speaking about the voters, don't ever focus on anti-bond, anti-tax voters. Let the Political Action Committee take that on. And if they want to try to convert those naysayers, they can, but it's more important to get the positive and the pro-bond people out and get them out. Get business people out. Don't forget about teachers and active voters and parents, the active voters who vote every election. And remember the 65-year-olds and above, they don't have a tax impact because their property taxes are frozen, and they sometimes forget that. Get the high school students involved, make them actively involved in campaigns, and utilize mobile voting locations at many of the schools. So these are the 7 critical steps for bond success. Internal stakeholders, you have many of them. Volunteers, central office staff, students, teachers, and staff, school board members. We've spoken about a lot of these, volunteers. The external stakeholders are the ones that I just mentioned earlier, but they go beyond that with media, with government agencies, higher education, anyone who's in the community that touches K through 12, that have kids in the school system, or the school system is connected to higher education, or connected to the city, or connected to the county. All those internal stakeholders all have an opinion about a bond, and we want them all actively engaged in the conversation, either being informed or persuading people to support the bond. So internal stakeholders are more at stake. They have more skin in the game. They're closely connected, but the external stakeholders are the ones that need to be persuaded. They're the ones that are going to need to be involved. And some of these people are the ones you want to get involved in planning when you're doing long-range facilities master planning. Let me give you an example of how 2 campaigns move in parallel paths. And what does it mean by that to pass a bond? This is what Jamie mentioned earlier about committees and the difference between an informed committee that works within the school district and an informed committee that works outside the school district. So the need is the first thing you establish. And the path begins, there's a district taking one path, and then there's a political action committee. This is a group that is raising money or personally funding a bond campaign to go out and inform people and persuade people to vote yes. And so you have voter influences that are being informed by the district out in the community, and the political action committee is focusing on voters, the active voters that vote all the time, every election. And they're narrowing the list down to get that vote out while the district is informing the community. And they're both making emotional connections. One's making an emotional connection on the need for improving our education system, and the political action committee may be putting a persuasion message out there that the school district that is improved and fully functioning and putting out engaged students is good for our economy, is good for our quality of life. They're both making emotional connections. One group is educating, the other group is informing. One group is using communication tactics to educate and inform. The political action committee is doing persuasion and getting the vote out to be sure that when early voting starts and the election's here, that they're out there voting for the bond. You've got pro-district informing, and you've got voters who are voting yes. And ultimately, it's to win. And so you've got 2 campaigns working on parallel paths congruently from the very beginning the bond is called all the way to the election. So the last component of my presentation is a framework for success. And so I'm going to give you an example of a school district that we've worked with in terms of how we were able to put a bond program together at a very quick amount of time. Seguin, everybody knows the Godfather. Everyone knows Luis Reyes from Seguin. And several years ago, about 7 years ago, they needed a new high school. And they knew they were going to have to spend about $80 to $90 million to replace their high school or to keep some of the spaces but build on top of an existing campus with a lot of new components, ultimately over 350,000 square feet of space. But they knew that they needed that economic engine. They looked at trends, they looked at demographics, they looked at growth, and they knew that they needed to call a bond. The problem was that they tried twice and it failed by as much as 67%. So fortunately, the board invited ERO to attend a board workshop, and it asked us, before they called the bond in late August, they asked us if we could come in and share with them and talk about our qualifications, and they'd heard about the success we've had in some other school districts and other public entities. If we could pass a bond, and could we do it in 3 months and turn this community around? And we said, yes, we can do that. But here's the things that had to be done. We had to galvanize and recruit a lot of volunteers. We had to get the community to put down all of their ego and their past and their angst with each other and work together between genders, between ethnicities, between rural and non-rural, age, young and old. We had to get everybody to understand that a new high school would support a higher quality of life and would ultimately create a better economy for Seguin. And so we quickly galvanized and recruited 120 volunteers, not paid, but to go out and be part of this bond group to be able to organize a positive campaign to pass the bond in November, which we started in late August. So we started putting together a political action committee and got a couple of strong local leaders to be the leaders of it, and got 40 individuals involved on top of 100+ volunteers to start working for a pro-bond campaign. We were able to connect the district with the facility committee, with the political action committee, and the community to work together, focused on one mission: to pass a bond and vote yes. And we came up with a vision that everybody loved, and we created it together. And we decided that if this high school could transform the school district to build a stronger Seguin, a stronger economy, and fill the community with pride, we wanted to take and honor the past of the high school and create a new future, a new facility that was going to inspire and ignite a future. And this was a vision that everybody could get behind. So the message was vote yes for Seguin, not for the school district, not for the students, not for a high school, but for Seguin. Together we can build a stronger Seguin if we vote yes. And we raised over $40,000 and started putting signs. And one of the things that the last 2 bond elections forgot is they forgot about the Hispanic community. They forgot about the Mexican American community, which comprises over 65% of the student demographic. And they forgot about parents, and they forgot about the 65-year-olds. And so we invited them all into the program and the campaign to get them all involved and engaged. So everything that went out in English went out in Spanish. Vota sí, por Seguin. We had personal testimony from everybody from all walks of life, from all ages and colors and ethnicities, and past legacy members and alum, and they all delivered personal messages about why they thought it was important for them to have the bond pass, what was important for the bond. And so in 3 months, the vote turned around to 67% in favor of the bond to pass an $83 million school bond. And that was because this community got engaged for its city, for its community, for its future, and the pride that they felt. And so now today, after 2 years of opening, this is their new $85 million high school. We're so proud of this. It's an award-winning school. It's won design awards, construction awards. It has become the darling of the Seguin region and Dina area. We are so proud of this school and so proud to have had a chance to work with this community and what we were able to accomplish in such a short amount of time. So I want to leave you with this thought. A good colleague of mine said this and came up with this. Why we design and build learning environments? We envision them for the children, our students, for they are the future of our country, and because they are our future, their pathway should be limitless in pursuit of their dreams. That's why you do planning. That's why ultimately you pass bonds, because it's for them 60, 70, 80, 90 years from now. Jamie, I'm done.
Brian, Incredible. Thank you. Especially thank you for sharing that incredible success story of the Seguin ISD and of how it was that y'all helped that district there. As trustees, as superintendents, we think long and hard on things like bond elections and facility needs. So really appreciate your helping us to wrap some thought around the long-term facility planning that we need to be doing as trustees and superintendents. Any final thoughts, Brian?
No, I just want to tell you that we will be at the conference. We're looking forward to attending the conference. We have a booth there. Anybody that has any questions or wants to come by and say hi, we'll be there exhibiting, and we'll be there all week and looking forward to meeting everyone.
Tremendous. Brian, thank you. That's our friend Brian Godinez of ERO Architects, a longtime friend of MASBA, a past adamantium sponsor of our organization. Speaking of our conference, then, we'll be meeting in San Antonio at the Wyndham San Antonio Riverwalk Hotel on Thursday, February the 20th. We'll be kicking off our conference. We're celebrating our Golden Jubilee as an organization, 50 years of closing gaps in our Texas public schools. It'll be a homecoming of sorts with various MASBA founders and past presidents, all sorts of MASBA past presidents coming to join us from throughout Texas. We hope that you'll consider joining us. Advanced registration is now closed for our conference, which is now only 2 days away, but you can register on site at the Wyndham San Antonio Riverwalk Hotel, February the 20th through the 23rd. One last reminder, our next webinar will be on March the 2nd. Jeff Clemens of our partner organization TASB, the Texas Association of School Boards, will be speaking on how it is that facilities impact student achievement. So please mark it in your calendar to join us during your lunch hour on Monday, March the 2nd at noon for a conversation on how facilities impact student achievement. On behalf of our entire board of directors here at the Mexican American School Boards Association, I want to thank you all for all that you do to help close gaps in our Texas public schools, and thank you for joining us for this conversation on long-range facility bond planning. Have a great day. Hasta luego.
Bye-bye.